Welcome in, friends. This is a very special episode of Unshakable. Today, I want to weigh in on the sudden and confusing discussion that seems to be all over the news right now and all over social media about what's being called the Red Heifer Prophecy. And I say confusing because depending on who you're listening to, this whole thing could be about a biblical prophecy or just a rabbinical myth or a signal that the messianic era is about to begin in Israel, or as you're hearing from some Christian activists, that this means Jesus is about to return. And so it's very confusing. And tied to all of those things is the fear going around that what's about to happen in Israel in the coming weeks or months could cause the Islamic world to explode in violence. In fact, you may have seen some pretty crazy headlines. I saw one that said, World War III is about to be caused by a red cow, which is hilarious, right? But there's some truth to it. The reality is that this whole issue that is now being raised has long been in the shadows, the background of the battle between Orthodox Jews and Islamic extremists over the land of Israel, and in particular over the Temple Mount and what's on the Temple Mount today. But it's coming to the surface right now for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of the war in Gaza and all of the hubbub around the world about what's happening there. And second, because Hamas has referenced the red cows as part of their justification for the October 7th attack on Israeli civilians, if you can believe that. They have cited the red heifers as part of the reason why Hamas attacked. So let me try to walk you through all this from beginning to end. And we'll try to put the pieces together so that you can understand how high the stakes are here, because they are. They're quite high. And so that you can join me in watching what happens in Israel over the next few weeks and months. First of all, what is a heifer? Well, a heifer is simply a young female cow that has not yet given birth to its own calf. And of course, cows come in all kinds of colors and patterns. You've seen them, right? They're black and white and brown and sometimes red and what we call roan. But cows are almost always a mixed bag when it comes to their coats. Absolute purity in color is extremely rare. And so any purely red heifer would not only be rare, but very valuable, especially if it were going to be used in a ritualistic sacrifice. And that's where I want to start. Yes, the red heifer is mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in the Torah as part of a commandment given to Moses and Aaron in the book of Numbers. So let me read a portion of this to you. This is from Numbers chapter 19, and this will give you some of the background for what's going on. Here's what it says. The Lord, Yahweh, spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Instruct the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without blemish, which has no defect and has never carried a yoke." So this animal has to be perfect in color and condition and has never done any physical labor that required being yoked. So very specific, right? The text goes on, verse 3, "You must give it to Eleazar the priest so that he can take it outside the camp, and it must be slaughtered before him." Take note of that, outside the camp. Eleazar is to take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times in the direction of the front of the tent of meeting. Now notice that phrase, tent of meeting. That is a reference to the wilderness tabernacle, that sort of moving worship site that served as the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem that would be built later. Verse 5, "Then the heifer must be burned in his sight," right, in the sight of the priest, "and the priest must take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw them into the midst of the fire where the heifer is burning." So basically what's being described here is you've got these ashes of this heifer, the animal's being burned, you're getting ashes, plus you throw these other things in there, and it creates almost like a paste type of thing, okay? Then the text goes on, verse 9, "Then a man who is ceremonially clean must gather up the ashes of the red heifer, gather them up, and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp." So they're to be stored in a place outside the camp that is clean. It goes on. "They must be kept for the community of the Israelites for use in the water of purification. It is a purification for sin, and this will be a permanent ordinance." Catch that now, a permanent ordinance both for the Israelites and the resident foreigner who lives among them. Okay, so interesting, right? Notice the original context, though, for this command. It was given as a ritual of purification to the Israelites as they were wandering in the wilderness toward the Promised Land way back in somewhere around the year 1500 BC, which obviously raises the question, how do we get from there, 1500 BC, to today's situation with the Temple Mount? Well, that's pretty complex and historical, but a lot of the responsibility falls on a very prominent medieval rabbi by the name of Maimonides. You may have heard his name before. He is without a doubt one of the most influential rabbinical scholars for Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews today. He was a Sephardic rabbi, a philosopher, an astronomer, a physician, and a Torah scholar who lived way back in the 12th century AD. And in his day, among his writings, he commented on the red heifer ceremony. He talked about its history, and then, here's the key, he laid out a very provocative prophecy, which is often cited today. Here's what he wrote. He said, 9 red heifer sacrifices were made from the time it was first commanded until the destruction of the second temple. He says, Moses made the first, Ezra made the second, and 7 more from the time of Ezra until the destruction of the temple. Okay, so, and we know that was in the year AD 70, the destruction of the second temple. Now listen to what he says. This is the key. He says, the 10th sacrifice, which hasn't been made yet, the 10th sacrifice will be made by Moshiach, which is Messiah. And he finishes, he says, may he be speedily revealed. Amen. May he so will it. So, 800 years ago, Maimonides laid the groundwork for some future time when a red heifer would once again be sacrificed in Israel, and it was assumed by his readers that that means that the Messiah would arrive and that he would usher in a golden age of prosperity in the land. So that's what they've been waiting for 800 years. Sacrifice of a red heifer, ushering in the Messiah. But, of course, nothing came of it for all those years. Although, listen, there have been whispers about this for a long, long time, but no substantial movement towards identifying a pure red heifer, let alone sacrificing one. And listen, the fact is that in that time and up until 1948, the Jewish people remained scattered all over the world. So there was really no ability for them as a community to organize and to try to live out this command. Well, fast forward then to the 20th century, and this wave, this movement called Zionism, this push to regather the Jewish people in the historical land of Israel, which did come to fruition in 1948 when the nation of Israel was reestablished in the land. And of course, that was followed by their spectacular victory in the Six-Day War in 1967. And if you don't know, that's when the Israeli army drove their Muslim neighbors out of the land, here's the key, and they captured the Temple Mount. They didn't have control of it, but they captured it from the Jordanians in 1967. And so in that moment, finally, after 1900 years, the Jewish people once again had access to the very spot where both the first and second temples had once stood before they were destroyed. Okay? Now, they had control of the Temple Mount, but there remained a huge problem back in 1967, because for the previous 1,300 years, the Temple Mount had been in the hands of Muslim conquerors. And they had not only built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, which for Muslims all over the world is a shrine which represents Islamic dominance and power, very special to the Islamic world. Not only had they built the Dome of the Rock, more importantly, they had built the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. And that's there today. It is a functioning mosque that is considered to be the third most holy site in all of Islam. Very important. And the reason for that goes back to a legend that was created after the death of Muhammad. It was said by Islamic scholars that Muhammad was carried to the site of the Temple Mount in what they call his night journey, that he flew there on the back of a magical horse that took him from Mecca to Jerusalem. And And the story goes that he tethered his horse to the western wall of the Temple Mount, and he met with Moses, and he met with Jesus and a number of other biblical figures, all of whom acknowledged that he, Muhammad, was God's greatest prophet. And from there, he ascended into heaven with the angel Gabriel, and that's where he was given specific instructions about the practice of the Islamic faith. Okay, so this myth, this legend was created many years after the death of Muhammad, but this Temple Mount then became very, very important in Islamic theology. The word Al-Aqsa means in Arabic the further mosque because of its distance from Mecca and Medina, which are in Saudi Arabia. And so this particular mosque that allegedly Muhammad visited in his night journey is now highly revered by every Muslim in the Middle East. And so for any Jew to speak against the Al-Aqsa Mosque or to try to touch it or enter into it would instantly be grounds for rioting and violence and ultimately war. And that's the situation that still exists today. And those of you who've been to Israel, you know this. Although Israel technically has control of the Temple Mount, and yes, they police it, because of the presence of those two Islamic sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Jews are forbidden to go up onto the Temple Mount to pray or to gather for worship. And in fact, very few Jews would ever go up onto the mount anyway. They just don't. First of all, secular Israelis don't care about it. They don't feel any connection to it. And those who are more religious understand how volatile it would be if they went up there. So most Israelis have just accepted the fact that in a very practical sense, the Temple Mount belongs to the Muslims. And the Orthodox, although they would love to see the temple rebuilt and the sacrifices restarted, they don't dare go up onto the Temple Mount today because they fear that they might tread on the spot where the Holy of Holies once stood, and they can't do that. So as it stands today, you have to know this, there is a tenuous piece concerning the Temple Mount. Muslims have full access to it. They worship there all the time. Jews just stay away. And Gentiles, Christians, have limited access, although when you go up there, you are strictly watched by the Muslim security guards. So when you go on the Temple Mount today, as a Christian, you feel the tension. It's really quite an experience. Now, key moment in the timeline. Here's where we really get you up to speed on the Red Heifers. The year is 1987. A group of Orthodox Jews come together to form something called the Temple Institute. Now, it's set up as a nonprofit educational institution, and today it's located in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. And their stated short-term goal was to rekindle the flame of the temple in the hearts of the Jewish people and beyond, even to the entire world. But then they also had a stated long-term goal, which was to do all they could in their limited power to bring about the building of the third temple and the restarting of the sacrificial system. Okay, to rebuild the third temple on that particular spot. And for more than 30 years now, the Temple Institute has been preparing for that eventual moment. They have been building all of the sacred vessels according to the specifications in the Torah, using original source materials, real gold, silver, copper, wood. And listen to this, as of today, they have finished all of the items necessary to restart the temple service, including all the musical instruments to be played by the Levites. They have reconstituted the garments of the high priest. They have built the 7-branch menorah, which is made of pure gold. They have built the altar of incense, the table of showbread, again from pure gold. And for decades now, they've been doing the work on genealogies to identify modern-day descendants of Aaron and training up a generation of priests who will be ready to do the sacrifices when the day comes. They've been working on this for a long time. I first visited the Temple Institute, I think it was back in 2009. I had a chance to go in with a small number of people and tour their facility and talk to their staff and to see all of these items that they were building, and also to see their architectural drawings and a model of what they believe the third temple will look like. It was a very interesting meeting, but as you can imagine, very provocative as well. Now, since the 1980s, the Temple Institute has been trying to find a red heifer as part of their long-term goal. Based on their understanding of the Torah and of the rabbinical teachings found in the Mishnah, they understand that no work can begin on a third temple until the red heifer purification service has been completed. They believe that they must have the ashes of that heifer before their mission can move forward. So they've been trying, and failing, by the way, to find a kosher red heifer all these years until the year 2022 when they got it done. They found a breeder in Texas, of all places, a Christian, by the way, who was able to produce for them five perfect red heifers. So these cows were purchased by the Temple Institute. They were flown to Israel at great cost in September of 2022, and they were strategically placed on a very secret farm somewhere, depending on who you listen to, by Beit Shean, in Haifa, or by Shiloh. But it's a very secret place, because obviously if Muslims became aware of where they're being housed, they might be attacked. And on the secret farm, they're being protected and inspected each day to make sure that they stay kosher, that they don't injure themselves in any way, or that they don't sprout any white or black hairs that would cause them to no longer be purely red. That would render them unkosher and disqualify them from being sacrificed. Now, I've heard rumors that 2 of those 5 animals have been disqualified now by a team of inspectors, Orthodox rabbis, but that 3 do remain kosher, and they are still to this day ready to be sacrificed when the moment arrives. And by the way, according to rabbinic tradition, they must be sacrificed before the animal reaches its 3rd year. And all 5 of these cows turned 2 in September of 2023. So the clock is ticking on their usefulness. If they're going to be sacrificed, it has to happen in the next 5 months, or else they'll all be disqualified. And obviously, the Temple Institute is not going to waste this opportunity. They are extremely anxious to get on with the ceremony because they believe it's God's will and that the Messiah is going to come. In fact, here's what it says on their website right now. Quote, "If there has been no red heifer for the past 2,000 years, perhaps it is because the time was not right, that Israel was far from being ready. But now, what could it mean for the times we live in to have the means for purification so close at hand? If there are now red heifers, is ours the era that will need them?" So their hope is to pull off their ceremony, store the red heifer's ashes properly, and then at some point in the future, pull them out of storage and use them in a purification ceremony that would cleanse the Jewish people as a nation, and then allow them full access to the Temple Mount once again. Not only did they envision rebuilding the temple, but in the meantime, what they envision is Jews having permission to pray and to worship again on the Temple Mount, even to celebrate the high holidays like Passover on the Temple Mount. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to you, but Muslims around the world, especially those who live in Jerusalem, they know exactly what that means and what it would lead to. They know that a 3rd temple means the destruction of the Dome of the Rock. It means the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that is unacceptable to them. They will quite literally die to protect those sites. So going back to Hamas, a spokesman for Hamas, a man named Abu Ubaidah, came out publicly on the 100th day of the war in Gaza. Listen now, he justified the attack and the slaughter of all those civilians on October 7th, partially on the fact that Hamas leadership had taken note of the fact that these red heifers were being brought into Israel. And they understood, maybe even more than the Jewish people, that a red heifer ceremony would put the Jewish people on the path towards a religious awakening, and that would ultimately mean the demolition of their mosque. In fact, that's why Hamas dubbed their attack on October 7th as, quote, the Al-Aqsa flood. Here's a quote from their spokesman, Abu Ubaidah. He said, "We will not tire or falter in calling all the free people of the nation to rise to support Al-Aqsa and the path of the Prophet, which the criminal Zionists are practically advancing towards destroying and establishing their temple. This is what we have chosen with our blood in Gaza for 100 days and for which the epic of October 7th was all about." Close quote. Wow. So the battle lines have been drawn. And at the center of it are these red cows. It's wild, isn't it? Now, let's talk practically as we wrap up here about what the Temple Institute plans to do from this point forward. First, about 12 years ago, they purchased the land where they planned to do the sacrifice. It's a plot of land on the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, but within sight of the Temple Mount. And that's important. And in their minds, it's biblical because remember what God said to Moses and Aaron, the sacrifice has to be made outside the camp. So outside of the temple compound itself, but obviously nearby within eyeshot. So the land on the Mount of Olives has been purchased. More than one cow is ready. And the Temple Institute has said that they have selected and trained a priest who is ready to go. So all they need are some uncut stones and some wood, and they can proceed. Now, there were rumors swirling several weeks ago that this ceremony would happen on Passover, which is April 22nd this year. So just 10 days from now. But then the word came out that, you know what? We're going to back off of that. That would be too obvious. That would create too much publicity and anger. So they backed off that date. By the way, one big issue that remains hidden is the involvement of the Israeli government in this. Does the Israeli government, the Knesset, do they approve of this ceremony going forward? Again, word has leaked out that the government has told the Temple Institute to stand down. It's not the right time. With the war in Gaza still going on, with the backlash that Israel is getting from all other places around the globe, and these continuing threats from Iran, they've been told, look, we know you're anxious to do this. We love the idea, but you cannot do it right now. And by the way, the majority of Israeli citizens right now are against it too, because they know the violence that will follow. So this is a very touchy subject, but here's the thing. The Temple Institute knows they have this tight window to make this happen before the cows grow too old and become unkosher. So listen, I have no doubt that it's going to happen. We just don't know when or exactly how they're going to pull it off, especially if the government is not involved. So if I were to guess, here's how I think it will play out. Again, I don't have any inside information on this. I'm just guessing. I think they will end up doing this sacrifice, but they will do it very quietly and without much fanfare. In fact, I think it's likely that they will do the sacrifice and not even tell anybody until after the fact so that they avoid any violent protests or attacks. And what they will do is they will safely store the ashes and then let the world know, hey, we have the red heifer ashes. And at that basically means at some point in the future, yeah, we can rebuild our temple. Trust me, even that will still create problems in the Islamic world. And yes, there will probably be more violence and some protests worldwide. But I think that's probably the best way they can go about making this happen before these cows become unkosher. So let's watch to see what happens. This could literally happen today, in the next few weeks, in the next few months. But there is that particular window. Guys, as Christians who understand the Bible, who understand the end of days, we always have to keep our eyes on Israel. There's things happening right now which are unprecedented because we know that's where the end of days is going to play out. So keep your eyes on Israel. Now, as I wrap up, let me observe one final thing, and this is really important. Let's just say that the red heifer does get sacrificed and that the Jews someday begin to rebuild the temple and restart the sacrifices. And in the process, they demolish the Dome of the Rock and they demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And, predictably, the entire Islamic world explodes and they line up against Israel and armies once again come at them from all sides. Think about what that might look like, how other nations would probably be dragged into the conflict, the U.S., European countries, Russia, China. And let's just say all that happens in some, I don't know what time period in the next few years. Let's say we do legitimately find ourselves in a conflict that looks something like World War III. Could that be the sign of the end of the age and the imminent return of Christ? Yeah, of course, that's possible. But think about it now. Isn't it likely that the red heifer doesn't bring the Messiah to Israel, but his counterfeit? Think about that. Picture the scenario. The armies of the world threaten Israel. Maybe an invasion begins, and suddenly a great world leader rises up and he steps in to negotiate a peace deal and he saves Israel from being destroyed. How many Jews in that day would be deceived by that type of man and maybe even follow him, right? Especially if he's able to do counterfeit signs and wonders. Might the Jewish people end up hailing such a man, the Antichrist, as their Messiah? But as the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel 9 tells us, we know the Antichrist will break that peace that he established, and he will put an end to the sacrifices and do what? He will establish the abomination of desolation, which I believe is described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 4, where it says, the man of lawlessness, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, he will take his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. The abomination of desolation. So think about this now. With this red heifer, are the Jews unwittingly laying the groundwork for the future arrival of the Antichrist? Only time and God's sovereign will tell. But it's interesting, isn't it? Keep your eyes open, friends. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you next time on Unshakable.